The cannon that killed your grandfather was probably sold by the same man who sold the rifle to your father. December 1870. A French artillery officer named Captain Renard stood in the snow outside Metz, staring at the twisted remains of his own cannon. The barrel had split open like a flower, killing 3 of his men instantly. He found the manufacturer's mark stamped into the metal: Krupp, Essen, Germany. Then he looked across the battlefield at the German positions. Their cannons, the ones tearing his regiment apart, bore the same mark, same factory, same family, different invoice. Captain Renard understood something in that moment that would haunt him until his death. There was a third party in every war, one that never lost. The House of Krupp didn't just supply armies. They decided conflicts before the first shot was ever fired. Essen, Germany, 1811. Friedrich Krupp died a failure, leaving his 13-year-old son Alfred with nothing but a collapsing factory and debts that could drown a city. The workshop produced cast steel, a luxury material in an age of iron, but nobody wanted it. Alfred's mother melted down her jewelry to keep the forges burning. The boy slept on the factory floor, wrapped in canvas tarps, breathing coal dust and disappointment. He should have starved. He should have disappeared into the footnotes of German industrial history. But Alfred Krupp learned something those cold nights that the sons of wealthy men never do. Hunger doesn't negotiate. By 16, he was working 18-hour days at the forge. By 20, he'd discovered a method for casting steel so pure, so strong, that it could cut through anything the world had seen before. The secret was in the temperature, the timing, the almost religious precision of the process. He wouldn't write it down, wouldn't share it. When workers got too close to understanding the formula, they disappeared from the payroll. Knowledge, Alfred understood, was the only currency that appreciated during peacetime. He cast his first steel cannon barrel in 1847. Flawless, a piece of art disguised as a weapon. The Prussian military wasn't interested. This is where most stories about rejection and persistence would tell you Alfred persevered, believed in himself, waited for his moment. That's a comfortable lie. What Alfred did was colder. If Prussia wouldn't buy his cannons, he'd find someone who would. Anyone who would. He sent catalogues to France, Austria, Russia, Egypt, Turkey. He offered the same weapon to enemies, sometimes in the same week. His sales agents moved through European capitals like priests of a dark religion, offering salvation through superior firepower. The neutrality wasn't philosophical. It was financial. When the Crimean War erupted in 1853, Krupp supplied both sides. Russian cannons destroyed British positions. British rifles, built with Krupp steel, killed Russian soldiers. The contradiction didn't bother Alfred. He'd learned that morality was a luxury of the wealthy, and wealth was a product of production. The circle was perfect. By the time the war ended, the Krupp factory in Essen had expanded to over 1,000 workers. The boy who'd slept on the floor now owned the floor and the building and half the town. But size wasn't enough. Alfred wanted permanence. He built Villa Hügel in 1873. Not in some distant countryside estate where industrialists normally escaped the filth of their fortunes. Alfred built his mansion directly overlooking the factory, 269 rooms, a monument to steel and smoke. From his bedroom window, he could watch the blast furnaces glow like dying suns. He could hear the hammers, 16 tons of steel slamming down every 30 seconds, a rhythm that never stopped, not for holidays, not for death. Visitors complained about the noise, the smell of sulfur and burning coal that crept into the curtains, into their clothes, into their hair. Alfred breathed it in like other men breathed mountain air. His workers, 15,000 by then, lived in cramped housing at the factory's edge. Shifts ran 12 hours. Children started at 10 years old, their small hands perfect for reaching into machinery that would eventually take their fingers. The factory doctor kept quiet about the lung disease, the burns, the crushed limbs. Employment contracts included a clause. Families of workers killed on the job forfeited all wages if they spoke publicly about the circumstances of death. This wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. Alfred had discovered what nations would take another century to perfect. If you control a man's livelihood, you control his silence. At dinner parties in Villa Hugel, Alfred served French wine and Italian cuisine on porcelain shipped from China. The chandeliers came from Bohemia, the carpets from Persia. Wealth extracted from every corner of the earth, concentrated in one house that shook slightly, just slightly, every time the drop forge came down in the factory below. Guests learned not to set their wine glasses too close to the table's edge. Alfred never apologized for the noise. He wanted them to hear it, wanted them to feel the production, the unstoppable industrial momentum that turned sand and rock into the hardest material man had ever created. Every conversation at that dinner table was underscored by the sound of war being manufactured. The breakthrough came with the Franco-Prussian War, 1870. The same conflict that taught Captain Renard about the futility of loyalty. Prussia had equipped its military exclusively with Krupp artillery by then, breech-loading steel cannons that could fire 3 times faster than anything France possessed. The Battle of Sedan lasted 1 day. French casualties, 17,000. Prussian casualties, 9,000. But the real story was in the missing numbers. France's entire artillery corps, their pride, their defense, was rendered obsolete in 6 hours. Napoleon III surrendered personally to Wilhelm I. The Prussian king became German emperor on French soil. Every newspaper in Europe mentioned Krupp. Orders flooded into Essen. Japan wanted to modernize. Russia wanted to compete. Italy, Spain, Portugal, even the United States sent delegations. Alfred had proven that the next war wouldn't be won by bravery or tactics or nationalist fervor. It would be won by whoever could manufacture violence faster. He'd industrialize death the same way Ford would later industrialize transportation. The assembly line of slaughter. By 1880, the Krupp factories covered over 500 acres, a city within a city. It had its own fire department, police force, hospital, schools. Workers were born in Krupp housing, educated in Krupp schools, married in Krupp churches, buried in Krupp cemeteries. Escape wasn't forbidden, it was simply impossible. Where would you go? What skills did you have besides feeding the furnaces? Alfred called it paternalism. Historians would use different words, but Alfred's true masterpiece wouldn't be revealed until after his death. His son Friedrich, called Fritz, inherited the company in 1887. Softer than his father, more interested in science than profit, in reputation than expansion. For 20 years, Fritz managed the business competently but without vision. The factories produced, the contracts continued, the world bought. Then came his daughter Bertha. When Fritz died in 1902, German inheritance law had a problem. Women couldn't own companies of strategic military importance. The solution was elegant and medieval. Bertha would marry and her husband would run Krupp. The Kaiser himself helped select the groom, Gustav von Bohlen und Halbach, a Prussian diplomat. On their wedding day, the Kaiser granted Gustav the right to add Krupp to his surname. Gustav von Bohlen und Halbach became Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. The company stayed in the family. The steel kept flowing. But the name that would define their legacy wasn't Gustav's. It was Bertha's. The German military approached Krupp with a request that sounded like madness. They needed a siege howitzer capable of destroying Belgian forts, structures built with steel-reinforced concrete, designed to be impregnable. The cannon would need to fire shells weighing over 1,800 pounds. The barrel alone would weigh 47 tons. Nothing like it had ever been built. Most engineers said it was impossible. Gustav said it would take 2 years. They called it Big Bertha, named after Gustav's wife, a cannon so massive it required 5 tractors to move and a crew of 240 men to operate. When it fired, the sound could be heard 25 miles away. The recoil dug a crater beneath its base. The shells it launched weighed as much as a small car and could penetrate over 12 feet of reinforced concrete. At the siege of Liège in August 1914, Big Bertha fired 45 shells. The supposedly impregnable Belgian forts crumbled like sandcastles. German forces swept through Belgium in days instead of months. The entire Allied strategy on the Western Front had to be rewritten because one family had made the impossible real. The name Bertha became synonymous with terror. British soldiers heard the distant thunder of Big Bertha and knew that whatever they were hiding behind, trenches, bunkers, earth itself, wouldn't be enough. The Krupps hadn't just built a weapon, they'd built a psychological apocalypse. Over 1,200 Big Berthas were produced during World War I. Each one cost more than a warship. Each one paid for itself in blood and territory. The Treaty of Versailles tried to end the House of Krupp. Article 168 specifically forbade Germany from manufacturing heavy artillery. The Allied powers forced Gustav to dismantle the weapons factories, to destroy the molds, to surrender the designs. International inspectors walked through Essen, photographing empty workshops and silent furnaces. Politicians in Paris and London congratulated themselves. They'd defanged the beast, but they'd forgotten the lesson of Alfred's childhood. Hunger doesn't negotiate. Gustav kept his engineers, paid them to design agricultural equipment and train components, tractors with suspiciously reinforced frames, locomotive wheels that could, with minor modifications, become tank treads. He sent his best designers to Sweden, to the Netherlands, to the Soviet Union, countries not bound by Versailles, where they continued their work under different names. On paper, Krupp manufactured farming tools. In reality, they were drawing blueprints for the next war. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Gustav had everything ready. The factories that had been converted flipped back to military production in weeks. The designs that had been destroyed emerged from Swedish filing cabinets. By 1935, Krupp was producing tanks. By 1939, they were Germany's largest weapons manufacturer. Again. The Allies had made a fundamental error. They'd treated Krupp like a company that could be regulated, controlled, shut down through legal language and international oversight. But Krupp wasn't a company. It was a philosophy. And the philosophy was simple. Wars end, but the demand for weapons never does. World War II was the culmination of everything 3 generations of Krupps had built. Their factories produced the cannons that leveled Warsaw, the submarines that stalked the Atlantic, the tanks that pushed across Europe. Over 100,000 slave laborers worked in Krupp facilities by 1943. Prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, people who had no names, only numbers. They died at rates that made the insurance actuaries stop counting. Gustav's son, Alfred, now running the company, didn't tour the facilities. Didn't need to. Production numbers told him everything. At the Nuremberg trials, Alfred Krupp was sentenced to 12 years in prison for crimes against humanity. His property was ordered confiscated. The Krupp factories would be dismantled, permanently this time. The dynasty would end. He served 3 years. In 1951, the United States pardoned Alfred and restored his property. The Cold War had begun. West Germany needed to rearm, and there was only one family in Europe with the expertise, the facilities, the institutional knowledge to manufacture weapons at the scale required. The Krupps were back in business. The company finally collapsed in 1967, not from morality or justice or historical reckoning, but from simple economics. The market had changed. Governments were nationalizing defense production. New competitors had emerged. The age of the family-run military empire had ended. Alfred died in 1967, childless, the last of the Krupp dynasty. But by then, they'd already won. For 150 years, one family had armed every major conflict in European history. They'd supplied Napoleon III and Bismarck, the Tsar and the Kaiser, Hitler and Franco. Their weapons killed millions. Their steel built the machinery of 3 separate ages of warfare. From Bronze Age cannons to industrial artillery to mechanized armor. And they did it by understanding something most people spend their lives trying to forget. Loyalty is a luxury. Principles are negotiable, and blood washes off easier than you'd think. The only thing that never fades, never tarnishes, never loses value is the gold paid for weapons that will eventually be used against you. Kings declare wars. Politicians draw the borders. Soldiers die for causes they barely understand. But the Krupps decided who would win, and they never bet on a side. They bet on conflict itself, the most reliable investment in human history. The Villa Hugel still stands overlooking Essen. You can tour it now, walk through those 269 rooms, look out the same windows where Alfred watched his furnaces burn. The factory is gone. The hammers are silent. But on certain quiet nights, if you stand in the right spot, the locals say you can still smell it. The sulfur, the coal smoke, the residue of an industry that turned human violence into a family fortune. They say the smell never really leaves.